Hey everybody, in this week one lecture, I want to keep this rather brief as you've got a lot of things that you're doing this week. You're going to be doing your intro video. You're going to be reviewing the syllabus. I want you to familiarize yourself with the Canvas website. There's a couple of key elements that I want you to do as far as taking this emerging adult quiz that you'll see in week one here. And also, I just want you to begin to start reading and really starting to enjoy the books that we're going to launch into first. And so what I want to do is just give some very broad and big picture ideas that will hopefully maybe set some framing as you begin your reading and your thinking and your exploring of this class. So I titled the course Emerging Adult Spirituality and Ministry for a reason. Each of these words have so much meaning laced in them. What do we mean by emerging adults? And is that different than emerging adulthood? What do we actually mean by spirituality? Is that the same thing as religiousness? How do we think about the two? And what do we mean by ministry? How are we looking or thinking about ministry as we think about this population and what they need and what good news is to them? So as we think about that, sometimes I feel like it gets boiled down in ministry context with other adults in this idea of, well, what do we call them? Aren't they just all millennials? That word is thrown around a lot, and next week two I'll unpack a bit more of those definitions. But it raises these interesting questions, and sometimes behind this "what shall we call them" question, sometimes things emerge in people's conversations and even in titles of books that are laced with meaning. And if we're paying attention to that, we notice that. Like, take a look at this. Not everyone gets a trophy. Revised and updated, how to manage millennials, as though millennials need to be managed. And where does this phrase come from about this idea of always getting a trophy? We know it's sort of joked about, but as you read Harris's book a little bit later in the quarter, he's really going to challenge this whole concept. Or this one, the millennial whisperer, as though millennials were horses or like some sort of animal that needs to be tamed in order for us to get them to do what they ought to do. There may be good stuff in this particular resource. I'm not super thrilled with the title, or maybe better, I'm trying to ask myself, what is the meaning that is trying to be attached to this particular title? And then you have books like this, Generation X Christian, Why Young Adults Are Leaving the Faith and How to Bring Them Back. What's the assumptions for that? Why are they ex-Christian? And what does it mean to leave the faith? How does one do that? Faith is a fairly abstract term. Are they leaving the church? Are they leaving all of Christendom? Are they leaving Christianity? What exactly does this mean, and what's sort of involved with that? You've got the broken cross there. It looks very, very dramatic. Again, just something to think about, even in the title. What is that exactly communicating? What assumptions are being brought to the table? Our good friends David Kinnaman and Mark Matlock just came out with the book Faith for Exiles through a bunch of research that they've done. It's an interesting title, though, this idea of being exiled. Is this where emerging adults are, exiled, or do they feel that way? Or what's the reasoning for the language and terms that are used, and what does that mean with the way that people approach those in their third decade of life? Then you have Generation Z. Even in this 18 to 29 age range that we're going to be looking at, we can't just assume that they're millennial anymore, that there actually is this other term that's used, which is Gen Z, or we'll read with one of the books later in the quarter by Twenge called iGen. How are these designations used? Are they helpful? Are they impediments? Are they too generalized, or do they help us see things about a generation that can actually serve them? These are the questions that we have to ask. Then you got Jeffrey Arnett's book. Jeffrey Arnett coined the phrase emerging adulthood. We're going to read his book, and we're going to try to unpack what he has to say. And then also an acquaintance of mine, Tim Clydesdale, and his colleague Kathleen Garcia-Foley has written this book quite recently called The 20-Something Soul, that draws on a number of places of research that really comes out of some of the work that Tim's been involved in. And so this is a book that I'm going to have you read as we begin as well, to just get a little bit of a sense sense of some of the conversation that's happening associated with young people in their third decade of life and their religiousness. Now, as we think about that, this is going to raise a bunch of questions for us. Questions like, well, who are they? Who are emerging adults, and how do we think about them? What are their lives like? Can we, before we label them, actually ask a more empathetic and inquisitive question of saying, what are their lives all about? Do they look different for different people in their 20s? And what can we say that's accurate or truly helpful? What is the world that they've inherited? A lot of times we assume that we're all just sort of free agents and that young people are just doing what they want, and the consequences in their lives are because of the choices that they've made. That may or may not be true. The reality is, from a sociological or cultural perspective, is that the emerging adult generation has inherited a world from the previous generation. Which is good and bad and challenging, right? So how do we think about that? What matters to those in their 20s? What's truly important to them? What assumptions have we made? What is accurate? What might not be? And how do we think about that? And then what do their spiritual quests look like? How do we think about their spirituality? What does it mean for them to think about faith or religion or spirituality? Have we been fair in that interpretation? My guess would be that the way we think about that interpretation has an effect on the way that we will respond to them or make assumptions about them, and we need to think about that. And then how can we seek to understand before we label or generalize or judge? And perhaps maybe that's a key part to what this course is all about. Before we're too quick to offer prescriptions, perhaps what we need to do is to step carefully into these worlds and to look around and to seek to understand before we're too quick to respond or judge or prescribe or minister to or whatever it might be. It's this work that we do, incarnational work, that helps us better understand those that we desire to serve. And so in these first couple of weeks, we're going to be jumping into the 20-something soul and also emerging adulthood. With the 20-something soul, I'm just having you read chapters 1, 2, and 5. I want you to get a taste of some of the most current research that's out there with regards to those in their 20s and their religious and spiritual outlooks. And so maybe as you're reading this book, you just ask these questions. What findings do you find interesting or striking or confusing? What questions does it raise for you? And what commitments are emerging adults searching to make through their third decade of life? Again, raise the question, poke around a little bit, let this study seep in a little bit and just help you maybe think about these things in some different ways. And then next week, I'm really going to have you jump into Arnett. You're going to start reading through this book. Arnett is really going to raise some important questions for us. What do we mean by emerging adulthood? What is actually emerging? And even further, what is adulthood? Can we give a good definition for that before we accuse those in their 20s for not being adults yet, or giving them sort of this pass to be like, well, you don't need to be an adult yet. And so we'll unpack that in the weeks to come. And so as we jump into this first week, I really want you to come really as an explorer, to look around, to see where the arguments are going, to see what phrases are used, to see how different leaders or researchers or writers are using them. And may that evoke in you a curiosity to truly understand this third decade of life that we're going to unpack. May you not tire of working hard. May your discoveries bring you joy and an imagination to think about what ministry might look like, what people's lives in their 20s might be about, and what good news is to them. And so until we connect again, may you know this week God's grace and peace.